Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And today, we're talking about a very legendary character. Actually, we're talking about the Shadow. Yes, the Shadow. The Shadow, who was one of the greatest pulp heroes who existed back in the 1930s. He, along with Doc Savage, those two were the most popular and greatest pulp heroes of all. The Shadow, who, with his black outfit and slouch hat, his mysterious laugh, and his two blazing .45 automatics. Just a fantastic pulp character. Had a lot of influence on other characters, probably most famously Batman. And he also has appeared in comic books now and again, the Shadow has, with, varying degrees of success. The best Shadow comic book was produced by DC Comics in the 1970s. And I happen to have a few of those issues that are reprinted in this hardcover collection, which I got back in 1989, I believe. I think it was 1989 when I picked this up. And this has stories by Dennis O'Neil and Michael Kaluta. And this was an amazing run from the 1970s. Probably this is the greatest version of the Shadow ever to appear in comic books. Because basically what Denny O'Neil did is he took the character from the pulp magazine and just put him right in a comic book. And the Shadow has never been done better, I think, in a comic book, or perhaps any medium other than the pulps, as it was done here. It was just a wonderful comic. But this is not the comic we're talking about today. This actually didn't last very long. It only lasted a few issues, maybe 8 to 12 or something. I don't remember. I don't have the original issues anymore, I don't think. I just have this collection. I should do something about that. But no, the version of the Shadow that I'm talking about today came out in the 1980s. Was it 1986? It had to be 1986. When was it? Let me see. I don't have my glasses on. That was a mistake. I will put it down right here. Whenever the heck this came out, I'll put it down. I think it was 1986. It was the mid 80s when everything had to be, dark and gritty. Now, the Shadow was a dark and gritty character. So you would think that would be a good thing, but no, it was done by Howard Chaykin. Now, Howard Chaykin is a very talented comic book artist who has done a lot of interesting things in comic books. And there are some good things about this comic book. This is a collection of a series of 4 issues that was originally published by DC Comics. This is a reprint. It was reprinted by Dynamite because Dynamite had the license. They might still have the license for the Shadow. I'm not sure. But they reprinted the 4 issues that came out in the 1980s that told the story of the Shadow's return. It is interesting. However, if you're a diehard fan of the Shadow, you're probably not going to like this very much. I actually don't know how you could like this if you really like the Shadow, because the character that appears in this comic is not the Shadow. I was actually very excited when this came out. When I saw it, on the racks with all the other comics. I was a big Shadow fan back in the 1980s, mostly due to this series, which introduced me to the character. So I was excited when this came out, and then I read the story. There are a lot of problems with this particular story. So Howard Chaykin, he's an interesting comic book writer. Like I said, very talented as an artist. So here's basically the setup for this story: The Shadow, Blood, and Judgment. The Shadow disappeared years and years ago. Now, the Shadow in the pulp magazines had agents that worked for him. And if you've read a bunch of the Shadow stories, then, you become well acquainted with these agents. One would be Margot Lane, who was transported over to the pulp magazine from the radio show. And then there was Harry Vincent, who appeared in the very first Shadow story and was probably his most busy agent. The Shadow always was pretty mysterious. We learned a little bit about the Shadow over a length of time. Unlike in the radio show, his identity was not Lamont Cranston. Lamont Cranston was a rich guy who sometimes the Shadow would take his identity, but he was not Lamont Cranston. He was actually a World War I aviator named Kent Allard. Or was he? You see, he's so mysterious, the Shadow, that even that might not have really been his actual secret identity. He's a mysterious character. At least he was until Howard Chaykin got his paws on him. So Howard Chaykin took this character, and in the early parts of this story, we see a bunch of senior citizens being brutally killed. There are a bunch of senior citizens. One is stuck through the neck. Another is obviously homeless and is burnt alive out in the streets. This is an interesting one where one of the Shadow's ex-agents is stuffed. He's stuffed into this water bottle here. This is, of course, impossible, but, it happens. It happens in this comic book. And, it's made clear that, if you recognize the names, you know that these are the Shadow's agents that you knew if you had read the Shadow novels. One of my favorite agents was Shrevey, the cab driver, who was also in the radio show. Shrevey has his head blown off with a shotgun, and so Shrevey is they just straight up murder Shrevey. I mean, basically, yeah, all of the Shadow's agents are just being slaughtered one by one. It actually takes a long time to kill all the Shadow's agents. Then we get to Harry Vincent. Now, Harry Vincent, inexplicably, is, at this point in his senior citizenhood, a magician. And he steals the identity of his former boss, the Shadow. And he calls himself the Shadow, but he's really he's lecherous because this is a Howard Chaykin comic book. He's a lecherous magician. And somebody tries to kill Harry Vincent, but Harry Vincent kills the assassins. Now, Harry Vincent's daughter, as it turns out, is a government agent, so she arrives on the scene. Meanwhile, we're seeing these strange characters who are obviously the villains of the piece. It's all very bizarre. The villain and the villain's wife and son, they're sort of comic characters. They're played for laughs, really. A lot of this comic book is played for laughs, which is not the way you want to write a Shadow comic book, but, what do I know? I'm just a huge Shadow fan. So the one good part of this first issue came at the end. We have Margot Lane that's still alive, and we have Harry Vincent and Harry Vincent's daughter, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And then you hear a voice. "You look well, Harry." And who should show up? It's been an awfully long time. It's James Bond. James Bond shows up. Which is the problem, okay? That's really not James Bond. You would you would think it would be from, well, everything about this character. You would think that this character was James Bond, but it's not. It's supposed to be the Shadow. So the Shadow shows up. He's just as young as he ever was. He has been drawn out of retirement by the brutal slaughter of all of his agents. And now that James Bond, the Shadow, has shown up, he's going to completely demystify himself and tell you his whole origin story. Because, you know, you gotta have an origin story. So, right away, this comic book is veering away from where it should go. Because the one thing the Shadow needs to be, he should be, is mysterious. He's a mysterious character. And the character that shows up in this comic book, there he is now, he's just James Bond dressed up like the Shadow. I actually think that Howard Chaykin kind of has a handle on James Bond, but he doesn't have a clue about the Shadow. So he basically just makes James Bond the Shadow. Now, another problem that Howard Chaykin has is that Howard Chaykin, from what I can tell, has the maturity level of a 15-year-old boy. At least when it comes to female characters and how they're used in a comic book. And actually, I would say that extends to some of the male characters too. So the Shadow is just completely shown as a male chauvinist pig right away. He identifies himself as such because, you know, he's back from the olden days, so he has to be a total douche. And he is. Meanwhile, we get his origin story where he goes to, he's in the mysterious Orient, you know. So he goes to, what do they call the city here? Shambhala, that's the name I was looking for. Shambhala. And so Lamont Cranston and Kent Allard find Shambhala. Lamont Cranston's in this comic book as well. That rich guy I was telling you about. Only in this comic book version, he's not the character that he was in the pulp version. In this version, Lamont Cranston is, well, he's even more of a jerk than Kent Allard. He's an evil villain. Let's just make Lamont Cranston the evil villain. Okay, Lamont Cranston is the evil villain. And we know he's an evil villain because he's completely evil, and he's even more of a dick than than Kent Allard, who, make no mistake, is kind of a dick. And we have time in this origin story for this is Howard Chaykin, so there has to be a sexual assault. Yeah, there's a quick sexual assault in one panel of the comic book as Lamont Cranston tries to escape so he can bring back an army and conquer Shambhala because it's full of advanced technology. And anyway, Kent Allard stops him, and as a reward, he is trained as a paladin. Basically, he's trained as a ninja, and he goes forth into the world as the Shadow with these special powers and skills that he gains in Shambhala. So that is the Shadow's origin story, which he tells to this room full of people, and these are the Shadow's bickering sons. The Shadow has bickering sons, and so they're here to make the Shadow even more mundane. And it just sucks. I mean, if you like this character, I guess if you didn't have any personal stake in the character of the Shadow, this would be kind of cool. You get to see him wear his Shadow hat instead of 45s, now he has Uzis, and he uses those to slaughter bad guys. And, I guess if, you're just here for that, it's cool. But, Howard Chaykin, he has to get all weird and creepy. And so we've got Harry Vincent's daughter that decides to start working with the Shadow, even though the Shadow disgusts her because he's a male chauvinist pig, but he's oh so handsome, and she just finds him fascinating because of course she does. He disgusts her because he's a male chauvinist pig, and yet she just yearns for him, right? So, yeah, so because he's so handsome and charming, which, you know, is all wrong. And then you have this scene with the scene that no Shadow fan ever wanted to see. What did no Shadow fan ever want to see? The Shadow hanging out in his bathrobe and slippers. Could there possibly be anything less mysterious than some guy hanging out in his bathrobe and slippers? Probably not, but here he is, hanging out in his bathrobe and slippers. Why? So that you can know, even if you didn't see the naked lady there, that, ooh, the Shadow just had sex. He just had sex with this woman. Wow, that's so edgy. And to make it even creepier, she's now calling him Master. You know, what should I do, Master? And this is the woman that was all annoyed with the Shadow earlier because he's a sexist pig. Now she's totally on board with him being a sexist pig and is totally happy to call him Master, which, considering the circumstances, is just creepy. So that's creepy. So now she's calling him Master, and we have the lame, ridiculous, stupid villains, including this woman who gets turned on by nuclear bombs. And the main villain turns out to be an old crusty, I'm going to spoil this comic book, turns out to be an old crusty Lamont Cranston, who's had it in for the Shadow this whole time. Here's the Shadow looking, well, there's James Bond again, and, you know, this Harry Vincent's daughter calling him Master still. And so the Shadow eventually catches up with the villains with his suction cups, uses his magic powers to calm down some dogs because, you know, the dogs are innocent. And that's the one cool part of this comic book, is that the Shadow doesn't hurt the dogs because they're innocent. And he's only after the guilty. And he does kind of look like the Shadow there. He kind of looks like the Shadow. Kind of. And then he has this confrontation at the end, and that is pretty much it. Yeah. And so anyway, the Shadow is back in business, or at least the James Bond version of the Shadow. I hate this. Steve Donoghue rather likes it because, from what I can gather, he doesn't really care about the Shadow. So if you don't care about the character, okay, I could see this entertaining you. It's a reasonably decent spy, superhero, vigilante kind of thing with a lot of sexism thrown in. But otherwise, I mean, if you're looking for a Shadow comic book, this is not it, which you would never guess from reading all of the blurbs, including an introduction that straight up lies to you. The introduction by Mark Guggenheim. Here's what Mark Guggenheim says. My point, and yes, I actually have one, is that his natural style, this is Chaykin's, unchanged and unembossed, fit the Shadow like a hand in a latex glove. Reading the 4 issues collected in this volume, there's no sense whatsoever that Howard is changing his artistic voice to suit his subject. Nor, however, is there any indication that the Shadow as a character changed when viewed through the lens of Howard's writing and art. This is completely wrong. That's nonsense. That's balderdash. What makes this, to my mind, particularly remarkable is the fact that Howard's run was the first incarnation of the Shadow to be set in what was then the modern era of the 1980s, rather than the character's indigenous time period of the late 1930s and the early 1940s. Think about that for a minute. Howard brought the character and concept of the Shadow forward a full 4 decades without sacrificing the 1930s, 1940s aesthetic which is synonymous with the character. Okay, the 1930s, 1940s aesthetic is not present anywhere in this comic book. That is just total crap. That's total crap. It's not true. You will find more total crap from people blurbing on the back. I mean, Mark Wade says, not since Walter Gibson has anyone been better suited to the shadow than Howard Chaykin. That is nonsense. Howard Chaykin wasn't suited to the shadow at all. He is suited to, say, James Bond, the character that he actually put into this comic book. Thinly disguised as the shadow. And you get a bunch of other praise on the back, and it's all crap. Because this comic, as far as a shadow comic book is concerned, is garbage. It's crap. It's blah. This one's really good, though. If you ever find these 1970s issues of The Shadow written by Denny O'Neil, this is awesome. This is awesome. Okay, that's all I have to say. Be sure to tune in to Steve Donoghue's video, who, if he says this comic book is good, is totally wrong. I will catch you next time.